Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session of National Links to Learning. My name is Samuel Marty, and I'm happy to be guiding you through this final session before our summer break. Whether this is your first time joining or you've been with us for several weeks now, thank you for taking the time to be here. These sessions are built with you in mind, and your presence is what continues to make them a success. And whether you're watching this, afterwards, welcome to you as well. A little bit of my final what is National Links to Learning? National Links to Learning is a weekly virtual workshop series developed in partnership with Procurement Assistance Canada. It's created specifically to support First Nation economic development officers, land managers, and elected representatives in strengthening community-based development. Each 1 hour session brings together experts, practitioners, and community leaders to share knowledge and tools that support success in land and economic development projects. These gatherings are about building capacity, exchanging ideas, and fostering collaboration from coast to coast to coast. Just a quick update, a reminder, today is our final session before we pause for the summer. The next session will take place on August 27th. Be sure to mark your calendars. We'll be returning with more sessions and fresh topics after the break. A few housekeeping rules. Please use your raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question or contribute, or leave it in the chat box. Patrick had mentioned if you feel at any time during his presentation you have a question, feel free to chat it in the box or raise your hand, and we'll be happy to answer your question then and there. So feel free to grab a notepad, water, or anything else that might keep you comfortable. Write down questions you might have or contact information that will be provided. Any insights or information from this workshop will be invaluable. After today's session, an evaluation will be sent out. Your feedback is essential to us, and as a thank you, you'll be entered into our monthly $100 gift card draw, with this month's winner being drawn this Friday. So now would be your last chance to get on that. Totally worth it, and it can be made for used all around. Today's session, in today's webinar, we'll explore the ASEC project, a major scientific infrastructure project currently underway in Moncton, New Brunswick. This session will provide insight into becoming tenders, the project's procurement process, and specific strategies in place to support Indigenous participation in contracting and business development. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Paul Stewart, Senior Project Manager with Pomerleau. Paul brings more than 13 years of experience in the construction industry, including the past decade with Pomerleau. A graduate of the Mechanical Engineering Co-op program at Memorial University of Newfoundland, he has led major projects in healthcare and science sectors and is well versed in the complexities of large-scale builds like ASEC. Paul will walk us through the procurement vision for this project and share how Pomerleau is actively working to reduce barriers and create access for Indigenous businesses. Please join me in welcoming Paul Stewart and board member Patrick Brooks. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge, since, a few of us are sitting in Atlantic Canada right now, specifically New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, I do want to acknowledge that my community of Sidunsis First Nation, also known as St. Mary's First Nation, is part of the Wolastoqey Nation. And we are sitting in the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqey. We share the provincial space with the Mi'kmaq Nation and the Passamaquoddy Nation. And the relationship that we hold with the governments and institutions and industry is governed and, guided by the principles of peace and friendship treaties that were first signed in 1725 and up until 1772. So throughout that those years in the 1700s, we got to a point where, it wasn't worth fighting the wars against each other anymore. So we did agree on a peace and friendship treaty, and since that time, there's been no subsequent treaties to determine how that relationship goes. So, we're still in that state of peace and friendship treaty, and it gives us a way to move forward into the future, and it's always constantly evolving. So I just wanted to put that out there. I believe in the power of the land acknowledgements. I think it gives everybody the opportunity to, put it out there in words and put it out there in spirit when we're gathering together, that this relationship is very important, not only to, Canada's future, but the well-being and, the First Nations who are working very hard to advance a standard of living. So, as a member of the board of directors for Can I represent, the Wolastoqey, the Mi'kmaq territory in the province of New Brunswick and PEI. So it's an honor here to be here today to help Sam and Tara out to deliver the Links to Learning seminar. I'm very pleased to welcome Paul, Emily, and Nadia. I just got the opportunity to sit at the same table as Emily and Nadia today at a Jedi Economic Development conference that's been going on for the past day. So we'll be following up today. We'll be in meetings tomorrow, and we'll be celebrating tomorrow night. And our celebration is going to be centered around economic development achievements at the community level, the entrepreneur level, and the economic development achievement levels. So that's quite exciting. My nation is nominated for a couple of the awards. So we got a bunch of us that's gonna come over. You'll see a bunch of St. Mary's First Nations people there to help us celebrate tomorrow night. And my opening remarks as a member of the board here is also to kind of share some inspiration about, can do and what we do as economic development officers. One of the ways that I approach the way I think about my job is to think about the past, the present, and the future of the Indigenous people. In the past, which wasn't too long ago, let's say prior to the 1990s, our economy was very limited. It was focused on service delivery of Government of Canada fiduciary responsibility. So it's just managing the services and programs that were made available for on-reserve folks. So, a government office, and then some infrastructure stuff, but jobs were very limited. Externally, our people relied on kind of like migrant farming and seasonal work. So we picked fiddleheads off the land. We went down to the United States and Maine to rake blueberries. Um, and if we, some of us were lucky to work on the reserve as carpenters, but there wasn't much employment off of the reserve. So then things began to change in the mid 1990s, and that's when we got into retail. So we started to figure out, okay, we could sell gasoline, we can sell cigarettes, about tobacco, and then our economy changed. Fortunately for myself and St. Mary's First Nation, we're an urban reserve, so we also got into the gaming industry too. And gaming is we think of it as a traditional Indigenous activity. It goes back way back in my lifetime to the early 80s. I've witnessed my grandparents gaming and gambling. So we cherish that opportunity as an economic driver to bring own source revenues into the community. Fast forward that 25 years, we're in the 2020s now, and it's evolving again. We're at the point now where First Nations are getting equity partnerships into major infrastructure developments and energy projects such as wind farms, being invited into the procurement space, such as what we're going to talk about today, and participating in spaces that it was difficult to be in the past. One of the things I also notice is that relationship building is, something that comes much easier to our developers at the First Nation level, our allies who work in the industries, people that are interested in creating the change that's going to move us all forward together. So I really appreciate all of those opportunities and the way that things are going into the future. It makes me think that, or makes me wish that things were more like this 30 years ago when I was younger, because there was so much uncertainty coming out of school as a young Indigenous person on what the future might hold. So it took a long time to get up to the spaces and into the spaces and the conversations that we get to be a part of today. Lots of times Indigenous people were, either they felt invisible or they were made to feel invisible in many of these spaces, but it's different now. I noticed that in a lot of our spaces, people are knocking on our door, our email door, or they're saying, hey, I'd like to introduce myself. I'd like to introduce my company. I'd like to talk about projects and how we can partner up to make things happen. And, so just being here in Fredericton at the Jedi conference today is kind of putting all of that in the forefront. And like I said, I get to spend time with Emily and Nadia today. And I've also met a bunch of other people at the conference today. So part of our job as developers as well is to kind of do the networking to build those relationships. We may not have something that we're going to do together next week, but it might be next year or the year after. Patrick Brooks from St. Mary's has this vision of what his community is going to be, that he's working on this particular project that's, for instance, a wind farm. I consider that to be a mega project in some regards. It's going to take about a year, up to a year and a half to build. It's in the range of a couple $100 million. So there's a lot of work going into these projects, and they don't happen without partnerships. And I think what we're going to talk about today with the help of Paul and Emily is we're going to talk about how industry developers, project management companies are, making space for Indigenous people as well to participate in other things that are going on around us, specifically things that are being built. And the procurement space, I've had the opportunity to listen to Nadia a couple of times to come in and give presentations to our Jedi group and other seminars and conferences that I've been to. And the work that she does for the government of Canada is creating a pathway so that we can get the access and the experience and the relationships that we can build to work together further into the future. So thank you all for that. I had notes in front of me I was going to read from, but I just decided to wing it. It always seems to be better when I go about it that way. So I won't take up too much more time. I'd like to pass it on to, I believe probably Paul's going to be speaking next. So thank you, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, you did well for winging it. No notes.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Kando, and thank you, Samuel, for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Paul Stewart. I'm a senior project manager with Pomerleau. Specifically, these days, I'm the project manager tasked with overseeing the ASEC construction project, so the Atlantic Science Enterprise Center. So today I'll be talking about specifically Indigenous procurement and procurement, but through the lens of what we're learning through this Atlantic Science Enterprise project. So I will see if I can share my presentation here. Okay. Perfect. So I think if this is working, somebody tell me if it is not. You should see the big slide, Atlantic Science Enterprise Center. Perfect. Thank you. So as I take us through the presentation, I'll keep it fairly informal. Should take maybe 30 to 40 minutes, likely to get through the presentation. you do not have to wait till the end for questions. So I encourage if I touch on something and it piques your interest and you want to ask a question, just interrupt me. We're in not a huge group here, so just interrupt me and we can answer the question on the fly. Otherwise, I will leave some time at the end for questions as well. So perfect. So to get right into it, thanks again for Kando for having giving us the opportunity to present here today. What you see in the background of this first slide is the rendering from Diamond Schmidt Architects. They're the prime consultant on the project of what the finished Atlantic Science Center project should look like. I know Patrick touched on this as well, but I'll do the same given I'm actually sitting in Moncton directly across from the site as we speak. So for territory acknowledgement, so I'm presenting to you from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This land is governed by the peace and friendship treaties that were first signed by the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, and the British Crown in 1726, And as treaty people, we have responsibilities to each other and to the land. I also wanted to take a minute and acknowledge some of our key partners as we work through the IPP process on the project. So Pomerleau would like to recognize the ongoing assistance and collaboration with many key partners in the ongoing IPP process, IPP being Indigenous Participation Plan. Specifically, major assistance from JEDI, Kando for opportunities like today, MTI. I wanted to mention Indigivisor, so that's Nadine Bernard, our Indigenous consultant, as well as our various subcontractors to date. I should also have mentioned PSBC, so our client and representing the federal government has also been incredibly, I would say, collaborative as we work through trying different ideas and what works and what doesn't work in our procurement initiatives. For the agenda for today, so I'll give a quick overview of the Atlantic Science Enterprise project, an overview of the IPP for the project, the ASEC procurement parameters, some of our current procurement strategies, and then some of our identified challenges and areas to address to date. So for the overview. So project description, as mentioned, located right here in downtown in the heart of Moncton, just across from the Georges Dumont Hospital. The ASEC hub will be developed into a leading edge facility to undertake scientific initiatives focused on improving the sustainability of Atlantic fresh and saltwater resources and monitoring and protecting the health of the coastal ecosystems in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Atlantic Ocean regions. The project has 3 distinct phases. So enabling works, which was preparing the site for construction, phase 1, which we're currently in now, and phase 2. So for high level dates, enabling works, we were engaged actually in late 2022 to start involvement in the project. At that point, it was constructability reviews. So to provide the design team input on constructability, on how this building could technically be built, and then prepare the site for construction activities. So grubbing, surface demolition, etc. Phase 1 is running now. So we've started really just this January, and it will run until about February of 2028. That's a standalone science annex center valued at about $100 million. And then phase 2, once phase 1 is complete, everyone from the existing facility moves in and we demolish the existing building and then construct phase 2 on that footprint. So that takes us to 2032. So if you've heard that timeline for the project and you've wondered, hey, why is this project taking so long? It's because we're really doing 2 buildings, one after another. As mentioned for location, you'll see the existing GFC site. So that's the existing building that gets demolished in phase 2. That's right across from the Georges Dumont Hospital here. There's your top-down view just to give some input. Phase 1 is sitting right on this parking lot. So anybody that's been in the Moncton area in the last 6 months or so, you'll see this parking lot's gone now. Instead, there's a big hole. We've installed shoring down to almost bedrock in many locations, and we're completing the concrete structure as we speak. We've actually just got full completion of foundations, and we're doing the formwork for the first suspended or floating slab. And here's just a description. So phase 1, that's what we're working on now, and phase 2 will be the next phase from 2028 to 2032. And here's what the render of your finished building will look like. So you can imagine this building in the white almost, that's your phase 1. And everything from these fins over to the nice stone facade is phase 2. For the ASEC team, so as mentioned, the client is PSPC, so Public Services and Procurement Canada. They have two key contracts, one with us, so Pomerleau to oversee the construction. We've, from the IPP standpoint, engaged Indigivisor to assist with our Indigenous methodology and IPP plan. On the design side, there's a contract between the government and Diamond Schmidt Architects. So Diamond Schmidt Architects are a big firm out of Toronto. They've engaged some sub-consultants to assist them. So that's Kier Portress, out of the Portress Consulting Group from out west, Han Martin and Associates, and EXP for their local architecture and civil support. Project description. In terms of the contract, so ASEC is a construction management contract. So what that means is essentially we are hired by the government to manage and oversee the construction. It's not a lump sum bid, so we have not bid this as a general contractor lump sum to execute at X price. We were bid to essentially act on behalf of the government to manage and execute the project. So Pomerleau will coordinate with the design team to deliver a phased design package and phased procurement approach. So what that means, essentially, the project is not tendered all at once. Tenders are issued in sequence with the schedule and when the design is completed. So, for example, we've had our concrete structure package awarded for the last 6 months on the first phase, but we're still only just went out for tender for our envelope packages. They don't actually close for another few weeks. And then we still have mechanical, electrical, and interior packages to come. So the reason we did it this way is just to optimize schedule. So the design was not quite ready for the entire building, but they could finish the structure, allow us to start the structure as the rest of the packages continued. So because we are the CM, construction manager, and we oversee the tendering as well. So we do all of the tender packages, we tender to market, and then we execute the contract awards and hold the contract awards with our subcontractors. Because we're so involved in that process, we have the ability to adjust the magnitude and scope of the tender packages to match the capacity of the market. So what I mean by that, for example, Pomerleau could choose to tender one package for all the mechanical, so your sprinkler, your controls, your plumbing, your heating, your HVAC. We could do that as one mega package, or we could split it into its individual components. So that gives us some more flexibility to match the package size to the capacity of the businesses bidding the tenders. For high-level schedule, I touched on this already quickly, but just as the visual. So base contract that was completed, there was only about $1.8 million worth of construction in that original contract. It was, as I mentioned, just preparing the site and providing constructability input. And then phase one construction. So it's about $100 million plus or minus for phase one, and we're just at the beginning. So we've tendered about 20% of the packages. There's another maybe 40% that's out for tender as we speak, closing around the end of July, and then the remainder will be tendered over the fall and into next year. And then we'll start the phase two tendering period. So phase two is about $200 million, so approximately twice the size, and we'll start tendering that maybe not as early as 2026, as I'm showing here. It's been pushed back a bit, but definitely will be tendering within 2027. For upcoming tenders, so what we see in this table is our tender package. So that's just the groupings that we use to kind of organize our tenders. And then every work package here is a standalone contract. So we expect an individual contract with every work package. So you'll see tender package 6.1. Tender opens Q2 2025. That's more or less on track. The tender for open actually about 2 weeks ago for these. They're going to be closing into Q3 at this point. They'll be closing late July, early August. But that includes packages like your masonry, your fire stopping, your doors and frames, your glazing, all your gypsum board, laboratory equipment, elevators, and then your major M&E stuff. So your fire suppression, your plumbing and heating, HVAC, integrated automation, and electrical, communications, electronic safety. I won't list through everything for 6.2 or 7.1. Just know 6.2 is kind of your interior finishes, your flooring, your paint, your tile, etc. And 7.1s are landscaping. And that will be tendered later in 2025. Maybe even pushed to 2026 at this point. Okay, so an overview on ASEC's Indigenous Participation Plan. So I've added a quick disclaimer, just for everyone's aware, Pomerleau, we're not an expert in Indigenous procurement and are certainly not pretending to be. we're learning as the ASEC project continues. So I think we've learned some really valuable lessons from mistakes we made early on, and we're trying to iterate and improve our processes as we go forward. And we'll continue to do that. So it's a long project. We're going through a major round of tendering as we speak. So we're going to sit down after those tenders close, look at what worked. Did we get Indigenous participation in our packages? What do we have for subcontractors to award to, et cetera? And we'll see what worked, what didn't work, where do we need to do better for the next round. Ultimately, Pomerleau as the CM, we still must follow all the federal rules, regulations for open and competitive procurement. So we still have to publicly tender these packages. We still have to follow the kind of the guidelines for award that are set out in the tender instructions to bidders. But we do have some flexibility on how we score the awards, and we'll touch on that later. Final thing, ASEC project does, because it's a mega project, does have some demanding tender submission requirements. So some specific bid forms, initial appendices, specific email addresses must be communicated with on the bid stage, and specific timelines must be respected. So if those kind of specific items aren't met, then we often have to void or disqualify a bid. So I just mentioned that for anyone that's interested in bidding. Just be aware in the instructions to bidders of kind of the items that absolutely have to be followed to consider the bid. And if there's ever any confusion, or if you need more information, or if you need more time for a tender to meet those criteria, just let us know and we'll accommodate, we'll extend, we'll give you feedback and help you through the process. But I'd certainly rather you flag it and say, hey, I don't understand this, or I'm not going to be able to make this timeline, than don't follow them. Because if you don't tell us, then we have no choice, because it's a public procurement process that we would often have to disqualify. Okay, for our Indigenous participation targets. So we've committed a minimum of $60 million across the full construction timeline towards Indigenous participation. Those commitments are made across 4 major categories, and the majority of that $60 million target is comprised of the business plan category. The other categories are, and I'll start with business plan again, I guess. So capacity development through awarded contracts via the project. So that means subcontracted work. And because Pomerleau, we're acting as the CM here, we perform very little work ourselves. We're essentially the manager, and we subcontract the work out, but we self-perform very little. So you've probably heard the budget for this project is $300 million plus. The vast majority of that value comes from our subcontractors' work. So that's why the business plan makes up such a high ratio of our commitment. We also have skills development, so any capacity development through training via the project. Human resources, so capacity development through job placements via the project. So that would be Pomerleau direct hiring, Indigenous staff. So that can be interns, project managers, quality inspectors, superintendents, you name it, any staff that are working directly for Pomerleau. And then innovative approaches, so any capacity building measures that don't fall within the first 3 pillars. Right now. Some of the items that have fallen under that category would be sponsorships of events, bursaries or scholarships, etc. For procurement parameters, so some of the procurement parameters we have to follow, again, given the federal structure of the project. So Indigenous business eligibility criteria. So who decides what is an Indigenous business, and how does Pomerleau, because Pomerleau's not in the business of making those decisions, so we're relying on the federal government's database to make those checks and balances. Pre-qualification, and actually, sorry, I may touch on this in a later slide, but on this project, I do touch on it. Excellent. So I'll summarize and then I'll go to the specific slides here. So pre-qualification. So we pre-qualified major subcontract packages just to make sure that the manpower is available, they have experience on the type of work. Solicitation parameters, so the criteria that I just mentioned on bidding and soliciting the procurement packages, and then bid compliance, so making sure the bid is checking all the boxes that it has to be a compliant bid. So that's stuff like insurance, proper bid form, completion, etc. And I'll touch on all these in more detail in just a moment. So Indigenous business eligibility criteria. So what constitutes an Indigenous business? Essentially, the federal government relies on their Indigenous business database. So for anyone that's looked into this in the past, you're probably familiar with the slide you're seeing on the screen. So essentially, for Pomerleau to consider a business Indigenous owned, we look for registration on this database. If your business is registered on this database, that's all that Pomerleau needs from a check and balance perspective for your work to count towards the Indigenous participation targets, and also for you to get additional, I would say, incentives in some of the scoring matrices for the packages. And I'll go into detail there in a moment. So all I'll say is if you know anybody who has a business that's interested in the project, we should look at, and you can reach out to us or to Procurement Assistance Canada if you need any assistance, but I'd stress starting the process to get your business represented on this database. For pre-qualification, so the CM, that's us, will provide pre-qualification documents to interested bidders, including a project overview and scopes of work. The interested bidder must provide the CM with the following during the open pre-qualification period. So previous project examples, resumes of key staff, for example. So we do have some flexibility here. That's the type of stuff we typically ask for. Let's say you're a new company looking to bid a specific package. We will work with you through the pre-qual process, but there might be a cap on the size of package you could bid. So for example, if you're a brand new company without any experience in the market, we might not award you a $10 million contract. We might work with you to understand what's the size of comfort that we both have, and we'll try to parcel out contracts similar in that size. For subcontractor solicitation parameters, so these come from the federal government's procurement guidelines. So different thresholds. So anything under $40,000, we can direct award. So if I need, for example, welding done on site, for safety rails or for some structural steel embeds, if it's $40,000 or below, including tax, then I can just direct award. I don't have to go to a public procurement process. I can call you up, get a quote from you, award, and we can proceed. If we're between the $40,000 and the $100,000 thresholds, then I have to provide multiple prices just for reference. So I'd have to go get 3 prices from bidders that could complete that scope of work. But I don't have to go to a public procurement process. I can individually reach out and find those 3 bidders to provide the quotes. $100,000, that falls under the public or above the public procurement threshold. So any package that is projected to be over 100,000 has to go public tender. So we post on Merck's, Building Connected, and go through the whole complicated public tender process. For bid compliance, compliant bids are only bids that the CM may evaluate once the tender closes. So that's a contractual obligation of the CM. It's based on federal procurement policies, which is how the government ensures openness, fairness, and transparency. So details on compliant bid submissions are located in the instructions to bidders form. So anybody that's interested in bidding a public tender for this package, the instructions to bidders is the first page you're going to see in that tender package, and it's going to explain all the criteria needed to bid. All right, so to more of the meat of the strategy. So the current IPP, or Indigenous Participation Plan procurement strategy. So this is, what is Pomerleau doing and what have we done? What are we going to try to do better with respect to being successful in our procurement strategies here? So we follow kind of a high-level 4-step process that we've been iterating and developing as we work through. So first step, work package assessment. And do I go into details here? Yes. So work package assessment essentially is we look at the needs of the project. So this project, phase 1, $100 million. What are the contracts for that going to look like? We're going to have a mechanical package for plumbing. We're going to have an HVAC package for ducting. We're going to have an electrical package, a drywall package, a structural steel package, a concrete package. So the first thing we've done, take that project, break it into those packages or its components. Those will ultimately form contracts. So typically your concrete will be bid by your formwork will go to one formworker, rebar will go onto all rebar supplier, for example. So that's the first thing, understand the project, understand how we intend on breaking it down into its subcontracts. Then we come to step 2. So that's your local market capacity assessment. So now that we know what we need for the project, we look at assessing the existing capacity, I would say, in the market. So, okay, we know we have all these packages. What do we have for businesses in the area that can bid these packages? So once we've fully, I would say, flushed out that initial assessment, then we go to step 3 and we compare the assessments. So that's where you're trying to draw the line between, okay, what packages do I have? What's the what businesses exist in the market? Do we think that we can draw a line between the two? Are we going to have businesses available for each package? When we do, that's great. That's the easy solution. There's a business that exists that can bid a package. So that's just a trigger for us to, okay, let's build that relationship. Let's say there's a Indigenous structural steel contractor. We have $1 million structural steel package. Let's make them aware early. Hey, guys, a year from now, we're going to be tendering this package. We'll keep you involved in the bidding process. We'll start to learn and meet one another and build some rapport before we get to the point of working together. So we just foster a relationship. The harder, but often more frequent scenario we see on a project of this size is we have a gap. So when we compare what we see in the market today versus the need of the project, we don't always have businesses to link together. So that's where we need to start to fill those gaps. And that brings us to step 4. So how do we build capacity? And a project like this, we have the luxury where we get many, many, many times to tender, assess capacity, and it's a long scale project. So maybe we don't have capacity today, but hey, we're going to be tendering all of these packages again for phase 2, and they're going to be twice the size in a couple of years. So maybe we can work in supporting the market to get that capacity ready for the future. So there's many ways to do that. It could be just by slowly building up work. Maybe they don't have the capacity to take a $2 million contract, but they could take a $500,000 contract. So we start to give them the ability to bid those smaller packages, bring in some cash, gain some experience, and start to build more of a foundation for the future. Another strategy is joint ventures. So if we're aware of a non-Indigenous company and an Indigenous company that could partner, and that would give both businesses, an opportunity to understand one another better, build some capacity, and ultimately bid the current projects. And then step 3 would be, the third item would be working to establish or create new businesses. So Pomerleau, we don't create new businesses to bid ourselves. We can't, but we can communicate the message of the project, make the community and the market know that those packages are coming and there could be opportunities to build. Perfect. How am I doing for time, by the way, here? 4:43. Perfect. Okay, so some of the current Indigenous tender strategies that we've implemented on the project. So scaled tender packages. So essentially scaling the tender packages to meet the capacity. So as mentioned, carving off smaller packages to meet the capacity of some of the businesses that exist. So we don't tender a $5 million mechanical package. Maybe we just tender the piping installation separately. So if there's a great Indigenous mechanical contractor that's expertise is on insulation, for example, maybe we take that out of the broader mechanical package and just tender that separately so they have the ability to bid without competing against the guys bidding the entire scope. Federal set-asides, so using the voluntary or conditional federal set-asides, because again, this is we're tendering on the behalf of the federal government. We can use set-asides. And anyone that's unfamiliar with either set-aside, so there's the voluntary and conditional. So voluntary would be if we know that a package, for example, well, any package, if we're confident that we're going to get at least 2 qualified Indigenous bids, say structural steel, we know there's 2 Indigenous bidders and they're interested in bidding that package, we would use a voluntary set-aside where we do not open that package up for non-Indigenous bidders. We're going to public procurement, yes, but it's only open for Indigenous businesses registered on the database. So that way we're still checking the box for public and competitive process by having multiple bidders, but we're guaranteeing an award to an Indigenous subcontractor. The other type of set-aside would be your conditional. We like to use this one less because it upsets, I'd say, your non-Indigenous market, but it would be where we do not set it aside up front, but after the tender is closed and we assess the bids, there are at least 2 qualifying Indigenous bids, and then we could conditionally set aside the non-Indigenous bids and award between the lowest or most competitive of the 2 Indigenous bidders. The reason I say that upsets the market, nothing to do with the Indigenous involvement, it's because they're putting a lot of time and effort into putting those tender submissions in. For packages like this, it's weeks and weeks of work, and then we don't actually look at them because we've set them aside. So it's still a tool in our tool belt, but we prefer the voluntary where we're setting them aside upfront. So it's clear to all the bidders, this is only open for Indigenous subcontractors. Third strategy, so weighted scoring matrix. Oh, actually, I see we're going. Emily has nice examples on all these slides now as I go through, so I'll skip right to my weighted matrix. So
Okay.
scoring matrix.
We're gonna start too.
Pardon?
Are you good? Or do you want to go now?
No.
Actually, wait, they're in a call right now.
So for scoring matrix, so proposing that bids are scored based on a function of cost and Indigenous participation. So this is the tool that we've used the most so far. So with every tender, we have a scoring matrix I'll show you in a moment. And for example, we're providing points. Some on the basis of cost, because I mean, we do have a budget to respect, but additional points based on your Indigenous participation. So the split we've often used is 85% and 15%. So you're getting a total of 100 points. 85 of those points are based on price, and 15 points are available based on your Indigenous participation. So let's say, so theoretically, just to boil it down, the Indigenous price in that scenario could be 15% higher than a non-Indigenous subcontractor, and we would still recommend the Indigenous subcontractor for award. And that 15% we adjust depending on the specific package. So depending on how much capacity there is, how much interest in the package, how far away from community it is. So obviously, you're going to have additional costs for traveling in and out of community, for LOA costs that the local bidders may not have. So we play with that 15% a little bit to try to customize it to the package, but I'd say the 15% is the good rule of thumb. And then the other item that we've adapted that's worked quite well so far is the minimum IPP content. So include a minimum percentage or value of the bid that must be committed towards Indigenous participation. So even if the primary bidder is not an Indigenous-owned business, we would mandate, for example, that to bid this package, 10% of your contract value must count towards Indigenous participation. And then we would ask the bidder to give us an IPP to show, okay, well, I'm hiring a Indigenous subcontractor to do a portion of my work, or I'm buying all my materials through an Indigenous supplier, or I have Indigenous staff working on site. So for example, they could commit a portion of their bid without being an Indigenous owned company themselves. We've used both of those strategies a lot on some of the tenders we've had so far, and it's been working fairly well. So here's an example of that scoring matrix. So looks more complicated than it is at quick glance, but you'll see this example, we're assessing 3 contractors. So contractor A, contractor B, contractor C. First row A is, are you 51% Indigenous owned business? So contractor A and B in this case are no, contractor C is yes. And then you'll see their bid prices. So contractor A, 100,000, B, 110,000, C, 130,000. And then there's some scoring here. So in this case, we also included a $10,000 minimum commitment. So you'll see contractor A, although they're not Indigenous, carried $10,000, 10% of their bid. Same with contractor B. Contractor C, the minimum amount would have been the $13,000, but because they're Indigenous owned, it all will count. So that's where you get to your Indigenous participation committed. So contractor A just committed the minimum 10%. Contractor B did better. They're not Indigenous owned, but they've committed 50,000 of their bid towards Indigenous participation. And contractor C, again, Indigenous owned, it all counts. Then there's some calculations, just adjusted bid value, adjusted Indigenous participation value, and then awarding the points accordingly. So you'll see points awarded based on price. In this case, it was 80 out of 100. So the low bidder here is going to get full points, full 80 points, their lowest bid. Contractor B is just a ratio to that, so they'll get 72, and contractor C has the highest price, so they're only getting 61 points. But then we factor in the points awarded based on Indigenous participation. So in this case, contractor A gets 0 additional points because they've only committed the minimum. Contractor B, they're getting an extra 7.8 points because they've committed above the minimum. Contractor C is getting a full 20 points because they're 51% majority owned. So you total those points together, and you'll see in this scenario, contractor C will win the tender, even though the price is higher because they have a much higher Indigenous participation value. For results. So through applications of the processes described in this section, the ASEC project has made positive strides towards fulfillment of our $60 million commitment. Although early in the project, to date, we've awarded $12.4 million in value. that's either been spent or committed to be spent in subcontracts. Of that, 5.8 million has been achieved towards Indigenous participation across all categories. So we're operating at about just under 50%. Some of our challenges. So this is feedback that we've received from our enabling works and some of our initial subcontractors and Indigenous partners on the phase 1. So some of the, I would say, the reoccurring issues that we hear. So access to capital. We're interested, we have the capacity and the ability to technical knowledge to execute that job, but it's so big, we don't have the capital to buy all the materials up front, only to be paid 2 months later. Time required to complete pre-qualification and prepare a bid under the federal procurement policies. So that's a big one. These packages are big and complicated. And although we're trying to reduce the size of the packages, there's so much technical information to put out that it's very daunting for a small business to go through 1,200 pages of complicated tender documentations, drawings, specifications, plans, and reports, and still be competitive with a bid. So we realize that. We won't be able to solve it completely, but we certainly are conscious of it and trying to only tender the bare minimum information needed to bid the project holistically. Clarity required in the terms of reference for ASEC. So similar to the second bullet, it's a big, complicated project. People interpret information differently, and it leads to differences and challenges in the bid. Increased efforts to scale contracts for involvement on ASEC. So we hear from the market and from the potential Indigenous partners that they want to see more efforts from us to scale contracts to essentially match the sizes of the businesses. So I mentioned that's one of our strategies that we've talked about, but we haven't put it into practice as much as I think we need to. So that's the parceling smaller scopes off of the bigger packages to meet the potential bidders. And then the big one, and for me, this is probably the number one bullet, more scrutiny surrounding joint ventures. So we've had a lot of success, I would say, towards our bottom line commitment through utilizing joint ventures. But I don't think we're fulfilling the spirit of Indigenous participation always when we're doing that. So what I mean by that, to be blunt, is we see companies creating joint ventures with a single Indigenous owner, but that single individual is the only Indigenous person that's seeing they're seeing the majority of the benefits of the project. So joint ventures are being creative to take advantage of some of the incentives we're building into, like the scoring matrices, the set-asides, but I don't think always the value is being returned back to community. So that is a tough problem to solve. We're trying to solve that through, I'm not sure if I have a slide on this. No, so I'll expand on it. So what we're trying to do with our current round of tenders is to build a minimum labor component in. So if we find we're just incentivizing right now based on that 51% majority owned and the contribution towards the IPP, but nothing for labor. So we're thinking, how do we incentivize Indigenous labor on site? So like we have millions of dollars of contracts, we have hundreds of people that will be working on this project. Even if there's Indigenous joint ventures completing the work, if there's still no Indigenous people working or contributing to the project, then it's a bit of a shell. So our next round of tenders, we've modified the scoring matrix to include additional points if there's a on-site labor component to your bid. So if you commit $200,000 of your labor towards Indigenous participation, then you're going to get extra points, even beyond somebody that's a 51% majority owned company. If you are committing a labor component, you'll get more points and you'll score higher than them in the ultimate process. So that's not a one-stop fixes all solution, but it's something that we're trying with this next round of major tenders to see if we get better results with real value-added partnerships. For bonding, so other things we hear often, so bonding and insurance requirements for large capital projects can create barriers to successful procurement. I forget the clause in the Indian Act that precludes on-reserve assets they're not treated as collateral by typical bonding agencies. So if you have a huge amount of resources and assets on reserve, they're not recognized when you're looking for bonding. So Pomerleau is, as a potential workaround, we can offer our own service. So Subguard is an alternative to traditional bonding. So on this project, we've already been pre-approved at Pomerleau's level for Subguard, or what we call SDI, subcontract default insurance. We do not need a third-party bond. So for you to bid this project, you don't have to provide a third-party bond. What you do have to do is work with our Subguard team, so we can pre-qualify you and we can carry the risk of your contract. But what it means is there's no cost for you now to carry bond. All you have to do is work with our team to go through some high-level checks and balances, and we carry the risk and carry the premium costs in the event something falls through. Procurement strategy considerations. So just other items to consider as we work through this process. So our terms of reference, that is essentially our spec with the client. So with the federal government, Pomerleau is bound by the terms of reference. That's what we bid when we bid to execute the ASEC project. So it's kind of our Bible that we have to follow as we execute the work. Indigenous labor incentives, that's what I just spoke of. How are we going to include some more labor incentive into our bids? IPP narratives, so making sure we're clearly communicating what we're trying to achieve and what the IPP on this project is. So procurement information sessions. So I would almost treat this as one, as a session to the broader public on how procurement works on this project. And so you can put some faces to names and get some contacts with Pomerleau for who you could reach out to if you're interested in bidding. So engagement, so in community engagement initiatives. So Emily's leading this for our team, and I will attend some. I'm also here managing the day-to-day construction, so I come when I can. She's visited some communities over the last couple of months, and I know has some more planned in the coming months. The intent being to ultimately visit all communities through New Brunswick sooner than later. Advanced notice, so communicating advanced notice of upcoming procurements. So it's something we need to do better at, I think. As we get caught in the momentum of the project, we need to do better to publicize those procurement notices well in advance, so that 3 or 6 or 9 months from now, there's going to be a tender that you're interested in, so you can start to get ready and prepared. Partnerships, so incentivizing good and meaningful partnerships. So not all joint ventures are shells, for lack of a better word. We have some what I would call real meaningful joint ventures here on the project as well that are contributing meaningfully back to community. And then business to business connections. So as Pomerleau, we're the facilitator, we have all the contacts, so we're going to try to put businesses, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, or otherwise in contact, so they can start to build their kind of Rolodex of connections, build it from there. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. So I hope I've covered everything everyone's looking for. We still have some time, and I'm available for questions for another few minutes at least. So by all means, thank you again for your time, and I will stop talking and give the floor to the group if there's any questions.
I'll just first start off. Thank you, Paul. That was super detailed and informative presentation. I had a lot of questions building as we're going through it, but you're able to really answer a lot of them as we're going through and nearing the end, where it's more of an exciting opportunity by the sounds of it from an Indigenous nation or perspective. But yeah, without further ado, that was we'll now open the floor for questions, comments, compliments. Those are always welcome too. But yeah, we'll give some time here. Open the floor. Patrick.
All right, Paul, I just wanted to say for the second time seeing your presentation, it's a lot more clearer. The information, I think you do an excellent job presenting it. And I think Pomerleau seems to be, from my experience and what I've seen, leading the way in this Indigenous procurement space. And I recognize that you guys are working very hard to get the information out. I understand that if you don't get the subcontractors that you need from the Indigenous spaces here in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, there may be possibility for other contractors to reach out to you and say that we're on the federal Indigenous business database and get qualified to possibly work for you too. So it's just not in Atlantic Canada that this opportunity stretches. I think it goes for a little bit beyond. I'm currently, exploring ways to get into that space. Unfortunately, a lot of our development takes place in kept local where we, just get into the place where we're able to look after our own communities better. And, that takes up a lot of our resources and opportunity, but certainly, entrepreneurs, if you're out there, take a good note of this opportunity. It's one of the best being presented in Atlantic Canada and possibly, across the nation. Um, just just go for it. Reach out to Paul and Emily and the Pomerleau team, and they will guide you through it, as Paul was saying in the presentation. So, wrapping that up, I got to step out. I just want to thank you, Paul, for a great presentation, and Emily for helping to bring this together, and the Can Do team for the Links to Learning webinar series. You're doing a great job. So take care, everybody.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'll quickly jump in just to Patrick's point it is a national level project. So we're all opportunities are open to businesses across the country. Obviously, from an engagement perspective, our focus is, we start in the Moncton area, work our way out, so New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada, but we look on the database for all businesses across the country. We try to communicate this nationally because a project of this size, not just for Indigenous businesses, for all businesses, sometimes we have to look at the full nation market to try to get the bids that we need. So that's a good point.
I just see a question in the chat from Geraldine. For bid selection, are we recognizing bids from Indigenous women-owned businesses? Indigenous women are getting into the trades and wanted to see what the percentage of selections are for those businesses. So I can kind of speak to at least what I'm doing I kind of work in the back end for reporting. So when we get all of our bids, we can see who's bid it and, compliant bids and assessed. We'll be taking stock at the final project report to kind of break down the demographics of how many Indigenous businesses bid, kind of the success, where we saw challenges, and then also kind of the makeup as well. So breaking it down into Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, but also Indigenous female-owned, Indigenous male-owned, anything like that. But we'll be kind of breaking that down in the project summary report, so we have a full picture of what that looks like. Paul, did you have anything to add for that?
No, I was going to say more or less the same. We don't build it into our upfront procurement, so I don't have like an additional weighted scoring just for women-owned Indigenous businesses, but we do whenever it's shared with us, we do collect that data, like Emily says, and we'll be able to report on it on the back end. So what percentage of our businesses were Indigenous, and what percentage of those were women-owned or female-owned Indigenous businesses. So. Perfect. Any other questions? Excellent. Well, again, really appreciate the opportunity. I'm more than happy to give this presentation anytime I'm asked. And really, for anyone that's listening, or if you're out and communicating with others, if you know businesses or individuals interested or that could be interested in the project, give them Emily's or my contact information, and they can reach out, and we'll help them along from there.
And Tara, I will send a copy of this presentation, but I'm gonna look at the recording and kind of extract some of the key text that Paul said to put in. So if you wanted to circulate that or cascade that around, then that's perfect, including contact information.
Yeah, we actually post this recording to the Can Do website on our web series. So yeah, but if anyone wants the copy of the presentation, that's really totally up to you guys if you want to share that. But yeah, you can send it to me if required.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Emily. That was really great responses, replies. It really did blow my mind, I guess, because I had a lot of questions prepared, but just even through these past questions, like they're answered. Like I was going to ask, what is the scope of the market that you deal with, and whether that would be provincially or nationally, but did a wonderful job answering that to where I'm kind of left out of questions and more inspired to reach out and, establish that network or relationship in terms of the systems you implement. So once again, I'd like to thank you both for your time today. Very well said, very professional, 10 out of 10. And I look forward to seeing the works of your future projects and collaborations with the Indigenous nations. But yeah, well, and once again, thank you to for all of our attendees for being part of today's conversation and for participating in the National Links to Learning series over the past several weeks. Don't forget to complete the evaluation that will be sent out shortly. It will only take a minute and enters you into a $100 month gift card draw, which takes place this Friday. This wraps up today's session and the spring portion of our series. We'll see you again when National Links to Learning returns on August 27th. Until then, take care, enjoy your summer, and thank you again for continuing to show up for learning, growth, and community and development. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.